Hey everybody, welcome to Always Bored Never Boring. I recently received a review copy of Dungeon Universalis from the good people at Ludic Dragon Games. The revised edition was available through a Kickstarter campaign which is still going through fulfillment, and with the likelihood of copies appearing on the secondary market and a new Kickstarter somewhere down the line, you might be considering saving up some money to grab a copy, so I thought I would talk a little bit about why Dungeon Universalis is, or isn't, right for you. And to be clear, this isn't a review, not a proper nuts and bolts let's look at the game mechanisms type review anyway. This isn't a review that's really going to tell you how to play the game. Hint, it's a dungeon crawler, you move around map tiles, hit monsters and take their stuff, level up your heroes and find more powerful equipment as you go. But I guess this is more of an overview of what it feels like to take on the challenge of Dungeon Universalis. And make no mistake, this game is throwing down a challenge. If I had to sum up Dungeon Universalis in one word, it would be excess. It's a huge box packed with contents, with beautiful artwork and more options than you can shake a tree at. But excess is a double-edged sword. Yes, Dungeon Universalis is a feast for a hardened gamer who wants something deep to sink their teeth into, but some gamers may discover their eyes are bigger than their bellies when they get served up more than they bargained for. While this game's excesses are many, I'm focusing mainly on two in this particular video, the heights of its generosity and the depth of the rules. From time to time on the channel you may hear me talking about how generous a board game is, but I'm not sure I've ever drilled too much into what that actually means. There are many forms of generosity and many ways to measure it. Some people will weigh it in terms of physical components, or replayability, price, or how easy it is to create custom content. For me, I think generosity is all of those things, at least in part, but also something more. Generosity for me, the most pure form of it, doesn't happen all that often. My favourite example, and the one I always roll out when I talk about generosity this way, is the original Warhammer quest from 1995. Yes, it was packed with great miniatures and board tiles, and it was very well priced considering what it offered, but the true measure of its generosity was in the many ways it allowed you to engage with it. You could play it solo, you could play it cooperatively, you could play against a dungeon master adversary, or you could play it as a light role-playing game. It came with a decent selection of monsters, but it gave you rules for using pretty much every Games Workshop miniature available, allowing you to easily make use of all those miniatures from your fantasy battle armies, or from other games. It had a full campaign system allowing you to level up your heroes, and it gave you all the tools you needed to make your own adventures. Warhammer Quest was the shining example of generosity, and I really didn't think we would see the like again. But now there's Dungeon Universalis, and if anything, it's far more generous than even Warhammer Quest could ever hope to be. You can play this game solo, cooperatively, against a dungeon master adversary or as a role-playing game. You can play one-off games or campaigns, you can create your own campaigns, or you can recreate missions and campaigns from other dungeon crawlers. You can field enemies from 24 factions as well as monsters and animals, and the box includes standees for all of them, so you don't even need miniatures. Although of course, if you do have miniatures, there's nothing stopping you from using them. You can play as one of many pre-generated heroes, or you can use the extensive rules to make up your own. There's nothing stopping you from using boards and tiles from other dungeon crawlers either. It is one of the most extensive game systems I've seen. But in attempting to check all those boxes, it's hard not to feel like the game's a little fragmented. Something like, to pick an example off the top of my head, Dungeon Saga is compact and tightly constructed. It works within a solid framework of relatively rigid rules, and that minimises the mess. But Dungeon Universalis embraces the mess. Little bits of one game mode spill out into different ones. Specific rules for a particular style of play are hard to find because they're squirreled away in a 124-page rulesbook, and when you're trying to learn how to play, you're often not entirely sure which parts of the rules you even need to know to get started. It makes the game difficult to unpack, harder to immediately engage with, and it's less accessible. The game's great strength becomes the biggest barrier to entry. If you can get over the daunting proposition of what the game offers, then there's a deeply rich and rewarding experience waiting for you, but it feels like you really have to earn it. And that, in itself, is not a bad thing. If you want something this grand and expansive, and you're looking for a lifestyle game that's going to clear a big space on your board game shelf and eat up almost all of your gaming evenings, then absolutely this might be exactly what you're looking for. If you like games that give you options on your options and incredible depth and detail, look no further. Just don't expect it to be easy. Because even if you set aside the game's generosity, forget all the different monsters with their special rules and all the different game modes, you still have to tackle the game's rules. Dungeon Universalis is really more than a rule set for dungeon crawling. It's a rule set for a dungeon crawling skirmish simulation. It wants to create on the table every little gritty and grimy detail, and it does it with a staggeringly long rule set. And at this point I think it's fair to point out for those who don't already know, I always lean more towards simple compact rule sets. I do like a few games with a bit of crunch, Mage Knight the board game is an example, but normally I want smaller rule sets that are easy to ingest and retain. That doesn't necessarily mean simplistic games, but it does mean games that are easy to learn and teach while still offering lots of in-game choices and fun. So while I'm not opposed to a hefty rules book, I feel I must point out that Dungeon Universalis' 124-page tome, which is purely rules as there are separate books for the monsters and missions, did leave me feeling exhausted before I even really began. And yes, I really had trouble trying to learn this game. The designers do understand what they are asking people to take on. For the second edition of the game they added in a basic rules book, but it should be noted that basic rules book is 40 pages and still considerably longer than most rules books are. The basic rules book is a great move and something to be applauded. However, I don't think it goes far enough in breaking down the barriers to entry. It's still a considerable chunk of book to get through, and one of the biggest issues is it lifts whole sections from the full rules and then just chops bits out, or makes a change that causes considerable confusion. For example, in the combat section, there is information regarding facing and the front and back of characters, which is lifted straight from the full rules. However, all the rules relating to attacking characters from behind are culled completely, so you're left wondering why you needed to know about facing at all. Similarly, the basic rules has a section that explains what a character's melee range is, says how you have to disengage from adjacent opponents, accidentally slips into Spanish for a minute, and then just ends, omitting all of the other rules for disengaging or entering melee range. And the basic game even removes diagonal movement, which I just found to be a slightly unusual choice that creates a number of questions as you continue through the rules. In the end, I decided the basic rules book was confusing me more than anything else, so I decided to switch to the full rules and start there, focusing on learning how to play a solo game. This was when it became very apparent that Dungeon Universalis wants to model the world as accurately as possible. It is painstakingly, possibly brilliantly, certainly infuriatingly detailed in all aspects. I won't labour the point, but I'll share some examples. First, characters have 25 different types of information on their character cards, some of which are divided into multiple sub-values, and 12 of which are attributes such as intelligence, perception, and endurance. One piece of information on the character sheet is weight, which is split into two values. The first value is the sum of all the items you are currently carrying, the second value is the maximum you can carry, which is your strength times your vitality multiplied by 2. That level of granularity is often reserved for role-playing games, but of course Dungeon Universalis can be a role-playing game if you want it to be, and some people are going to love that. Other people are going to feel it's all a bit too much. Speaking of too much, every system in this game has its own subsystem you need to learn. You may not need to know all of them all of the time, but you will need to know some of them some of the time, and there is loads of information to retain, the kind of amounts that only repeat, consistent, regular play can help with. This is absolutely not a game you learn in one sitting reading the rules. I guess, much like being an adventurer in a fantasy land, to a certain degree you have to learn things on the job. You have to dive in, get your hands dirty, and live the life for it all to stick. Here's an extract of the rules for melee range. Each character exercises a zone of influence on each of its adjacent squares, including diagonals. We call this the character's melee range. A running character cannot move through any squares adjacent to an enemy, even if the enemy cannot engage him. A character who does not run may enter an enemy's melee range. Any character who enters a square which is part of an enemy's melee range must end his movement there. Then, both characters are considered to be engaged. Characters are considered engaged if they are within the melee range of an enemy. Notwithstanding the above, a character, A, as long as he does not run, will ignore the melee range of an enemy, B, and therefore will not be engaged in the following situations. B is smaller than A, B is adjacent to one of the allies of A with a size equal to or greater than his own, B is adjacent to two or more allies of A with a size immediately inferior to his own. In other words, characters can only be engaged by other characters of the same or higher size, or by 2 or more adjacent enemies of immediately lower size. In turn, they can keep 2 smaller enemies engaged. Creatures and characters will always ignore the melee range of much smaller enemies, regardless of how many they have adjacent. Remember that this happens when there is a difference of at least 2 levels in height or size between 2 characters or creatures. And those aren't all of the subsystems involving melee range either. It goes on. There are additional rules on moving within melee ranges and disengaging from them too. But just think for a moment about all that detail, all those mechanisms. It's an incredibly intricate system, rewarding deep tactical thought when moving, and promoting strategic planning and careful positioning during combat. Taking advantage of the positions of smaller enemies to outmaneuver the larger ones, skirting out of reach of the biggest threats, creating shield walls to prevent characters from running to exits. It's all there, all masterfully intertwined into a big mess of rules. Untangle it, and you have a rich combat system that rewards clever play, adding layers of reality to a sophisticated simulation. It's a system that will reward every choice you make, if you remember every choice you can make. And the level of grit and texture in every rule isn't always so blatant. Sometimes it's just a series of small things that add up with exceptions on exceptions. Consider shooting. There are, as you would imagine, a host of modifiers when shooting. Several relate to movement. If you move up to half your movement, the modifier is -1. If you move more than half your movement, the modifier is -2. However, this penalty doesn't apply to throwing weapons as long as you only move 1 or 2 squares, regardless of your movement stat. It's the little things like that that are going to trip you up for a while, the exception to the rule, and admittedly, those modifiers all make sense. Moving 1 or 2 squares would represent taking a run-up when throwing an object, but it's definitely the sort of thing I'm going to forget when I also have to calculate modifiers for cover, shooting at small targets, or, my personal favourite, shooting at a target that is more agile than you are. And I do want to stress there isn't any one rule that makes the game feel so densely packed and difficult to learn. A lot of the rules are relatively intuitive. I mean, at the most basic level, the game is as straightforward as it gets. On your turn you can move, take one action such as attacking, and make one quick action such as drinking a potion. One of the core mechanisms is the attribute test, where you are simply rolling 2d6 and adding stats and modifiers to score 10 or more, or in the case of opposed tests, simply to score more than your opponent. Meanwhile, causing damage is a straightforward gobs of dice affair, where you roll d6 equal to your relevant stat plus any modifiers and cause 1 wound for each result equaling or exceeding the target's armour. But then there are all those other details layered on top of that core framework. That's where all the flavour is, but it's also where all the crunch is, and it's the bit you might break your teeth on before you ever get to sink them into the game. So yes, excess is the word of the day. Everything about this game is big, right down to the way it models the smallest details, and if you're interested in this game, I think you really need to make a suitably big space for it in your life. This is a game that demands to be the main attraction, possibly the only attraction, without distraction. You can't play a quick game of this then grab a quick game of something else. This has to be the only game in town, a fully realised, functioning, realistic fantasy town populated by complex NPCs in a sprawling campaign. And if you can make that space, if you can fully embrace what this game is and everything you could make it, then this could be a fantastic choice for you. For me, it's all just a bit much. I yearn for simple rule sets that offer interesting choices. I don't really want to calculate 5 or 6 different modifiers just to shoot an arrow, and I like to play different games. I like to mix it up with different styles and genres. I think when I was a kid, I could have given Dungeon Universalis the time and care it needs, just like I did with Warhammer Quest. I mean, this is like a super enhanced version of that old classic. But as much as I would love to live in a fantasy world for extended periods of time, to engross myself in everything that world is, to become embroiled in an expansive campaign that involves travelling around a map of the world and visiting different towns and interacting with a host of different characters, that just isn't possible anymore. I only get to make fleeting visits when real life allows it. And Dungeon Universalis doesn't want visitors, it wants residents. And trying to treat the game any other way, trying to treat it as a game where you just pop in every now and again, just doesn't feel right. It's like looking a gift horse in the mouth. A really big, generous gift horse. Did I mention you can ride horses in this game?